everyone, I'm going to be making some cookies. This is actually a pretty simple recipe. It's based off of chocolate chip cookies, but there's a lot of tweaks. It's a recipe that my husband and I actually came up with together over 10 years ago, long before we were married, but it's delicious and we still make it to this day, so I'm going to share it. Everything you see before you goes into the cookies. Before I start, I'm going to preheat my oven. I think 375? 350. 350 degrees, classic. 355 is good enough. Same thing, really. Everything you see here makes these cookies. I'm actually making a 2/3 recipe. I will put the full recipe in the video description below. I almost never make a full recipe. I either make like a third of a recipe if I just want a few cookies, or like a 2/3 recipe, which is what I'm doing right now. So you've got a cup of all-purpose flour, 2/3 of a cup of sugar, so I have white sugar here and brown sugar here. It's nice if you use both kinds. 1 whole egg. This is, I guess, why the 2/3 recipe is technically the best, because it uses 1 whole egg. It also uses 1 whole stick of butter, 2 tablespoons of cocoa powder, some vanilla, and some salt. And then these are the other goodies that make it a little bit different from chocolate chip cookies. Instead of chocolate chips, we're using, these are peanut butter chips. They taste a lot like the peanut butter that's in Reese's peanut butter cups, very salty and very sweet. They are lovely in these cookies. And then these are macadamia nuts, which I've roughly chopped. These are raw macadamias. They're not roasted and salted. So my first step is going to be to melt this butter. All right, there is the butter melted. Now, another thing I like about this recipe is it does not require any fancy creaming or anything. No stand mixer, no hand mixer. And just mush the butter the rest of the way with a spatula until it melts. I like using a stiff spatula like this to mix stuff like this, by the way, because that way I can just use the same spatula to clean the bowl afterwards and I don't have to dirty up another utensil. All right, to this butter, we are going to add both of our sugars. 1/3 of a cup of white sugar, 1/3 of a cup of brown sugar. All we're really doing is just stirring until the sugars kind of melt into the butter a little bit. Again, this is a really lazy cookie recipe. It's like lazy, but really, really tasty. I like to go ahead and add the vanilla here. My recipe just says vanilla. That's so very Sarah. Just splash in some vanilla until you're happy. I don't know, that was probably half a teaspoon. And the vanilla is really just there to amp up the chocolate. Ooh, you know what? Stroke of inspiration. I'm going to add a little splash of creme de cacao in here to amp up the chocolate flavor too. This is chocolate liqueur. I don't know, like a half to a full teaspoon. Incidentally, it's also really good in just regular chocolate chip cookies. All right, and you know what? I will add the salt at this point too. And my recipe just says salt. It doesn't say how much. So I'm just gonna put some salt in. You don't need too terribly much salt because the peanut butter chips are salty. Like a little bit of salt though. Okay, now I'm gonna add the egg. As you can see, it's blended nicely. It looks kind of like butterscotch sauce. And it kind of is. I mean, brown sugar and butter is butterscotch. Just add a little cream and cook it and it's butterscotch sauce. Okay, those are our wet ingredients. And one more wet ingredient that's actually dry, the cocoa powder. I actually forgot. Usually, I even wrote this in my recipe, usually I add this at the start when I just have the melted butter, but I'm adding it now and that's okay. 2 tablespoons. Now, if you've worked with cocoa powder before, you'll know that it does not like to mix with wet ingredients. But it does okay mixing with like fat. That was my oven. But it does okay with mixing with fats like melted butter. There. All nice and smooth. Right, and now a lot of recipes will have you mix the dry ingredients in a separate bowl. But if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I like to avoid dirtying extra bowls and utensils as much as possible. 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder in the whole recipe. It's actually quite a lot of baking powder. These are kind of cakier cookies. I think I developed this recipe back when I preferred cakier chocolate chip cookies. Now I prefer flatter, chewier kind. Anyway, I did a little less than 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And then what I do is I just kind of use my spatula to kind of mix the baking powder with the flour on top before I start to incorporate it in. Ah, I'm so scared I'm going to knock over my camera. I really need to get a sturdier tripod. This tripod is so incredibly rickety. Like, at least once my camera fell over while I was trying to film myself cooking something. That's why often I'll just be hand holding the camera, which is not ideal because I think the picture is a little shaky. And then if I'm trying to do something like hold a bowl with one hand and mix with another, I can't do that if I'm holding a camera. So yeah, I should probably bite the bullet and get a new tripod, or I don't know, maybe try to fix this tripod. I don't know, things just aren't built to last nowadays. Companies want you to buy new things all the time so that they can have your money and you can stay poor. It's an awesome system. I love it. Okay, and now that that's incorporated, I'm going to add our goodies. 2/3 of a cup of peanut butter chips and 2/3 of a cup of macadamia. I have made this recipe with hazelnuts, I believe it was. You could use peanuts. I just feel like that would be a little redundant because you already have the peanut butter chips. I mean, obviously you can make this to your liking. You can substitute the peanut butter chips with any other kind of chip. Like I said, it's chocolate chip cookie recipe, basically, with just some certain things subbed out and cocoa powder added. And now creme de cacao added. And there you go, there's your dough. Now my oven is already preheated, so I'm just gonna form these cookies now. I use this little ice cream scoop so that they're all relatively the same size. And you know, it has been years since I last made these cookies, so I frankly don't know how far I should space these apart. I imagine I should make a dozen at a time. The recipe says that the full recipe makes 3 dozen of these little cookies, so in theory, this 2/3 of a recipe should make, what's the answer, class? 2 dozen. In all honesty, if you have a child, or if you just know somebody, even yourself, who's struggling with basic math like that, like baking and cooking is actually a really good way of teaching people about fractions and stuff like that. I had a math student, pre-algebra, I don't know, it's like 10 years ago now, and that's mostly what I did to teach her the concepts of fractions and stuff, is I would have her, like I brought a cookbook to our sessions and I just have her reduce or increase recipes. I'd say, okay, this recipe serves 12, now make it serve 17. How do you do that? It's actually a really good exercise for math. Okay, here are all of our cookies. I think they'll spread out a little bit in the oven, but like I said, because these are cakier, they might not spread out much. They might just be round and pucky like this. We'll see. I'm gonna bake them in a 350-degree oven for 10 to 12 minutes, the recipe says. I'm gonna err on the side of like 8 minutes. Okay, and I'm just gonna let these cookies sit on the hot cookie sheet for a couple minutes to solidify just a bit before I transfer them directly onto the wire rack and cook the rest of the dough. Okay, it has been 5 minutes and the cookies have set up a little bit, so I'm just gonna transfer them now directly to this wire rack. And yeah, I wound up baking these for about 8 minutes. I actually don't know because I forgot to turn on my timer. And then I remembered. That happens to me a lot. Usually when I forget and then remember, you know, I can just pick them up with my fingers. Don't try this at home, kids. Usually when I forget to set my timer and then realize that I forgot, it's like 1 to 2 minutes. So I'll just set my timer for 1 to 2 minutes less than I was intending on setting it. So I think I baked these for about 8 minutes, but I'm not actually sure. Anyway, they're just set, but still a little bit soft, and that's what you want in this kind of cookie. You don't want to cook them all the way through. If you look at the bottom, they're nice and brown. Well, you kind of can't tell because these are chocolate. Anyway, I'm going to scoop out the rest of the cookies and bake them. Well, I was right. It was not 24 cookies, but 21 cookies. think I was a little generous in my scoops. I'll bake these for another 8 minutes. Okay, since these cookies are best fresh out of the oven and nice and hot and gooey, I'm gonna have some now while the second batch is baking. Yes, I changed my shirt and put on a pair of glasses. Continuity is for suckers. Milk. Okay, here's my lovely cookie fresh out of the oven. Now these peanut butter chips they're not as melty as chocolate chips, so you're not gonna get that satisfying like melty pull that you do with chocolate chips, but it's so nice and gooey on the inside. That's so good. Just like pure peanut butter, it sticks to the roof of your mouth when it's warm like this, but it's so good. And they're very rich, so like just 2 cookies will do it. Anyway, hope you try it. Thank you to all of my patrons for making this and other videos possible on my channel. I'd like to give some special thanks to Aditya, Anna, Britta, Crinkum, Data Fox, Gina F, Gina S, Honey Badgers, Jamie, Jenny D, Jocelyn, Katie, Matthew, Morgan, Stacy, Veda, and Veet Fafo.